It is another pre-monsoon shower here, going strong, and took the power out. So I'm doing this in this strange light. Nonetheless, at some point along the way, after the 70s, when Wally Broker said global warming is here, CO2 is increasing, and then in the 80s, Jim Hansen made a statement to the US Congress saying global warming was really here and was dangerous, and so on. The negotiations after the UNFCCC and the IPCC were established slowly headed towards this CO2, which this book refers to as the CO2 politics, but again, without being political about it, the point is that now lots of the negotiations are focused on and around CO2, and the IPCC assessment reports do put out very detailed maps of impacts that are already documented in natural systems, biological, physical, and human managed systems, and so on. And then it comes down to, again, the CO2 levels, or the CO2 equivalent levels we are headed at. So this is just to re-emphasize that the carbon fractal trap is here. So I just picked this up from this site called the Numerical, which lists the commitments by countries to phase out coal power plants, and you expect there are more countries. I just picked some random ones here. So if you think about Chile, which is a developing country, it has a target date of 2040, the year by which the country will shut coal power plants. So you expect that's not so surprising. But then there is Denmark currently has 3 power plants, and its plan is at 2030. Denmark is massive on renewables and other climate action, waste recycling, carbon capture, etc. And yet it's going to burn coal for a while. Austria is quicker, 2020. I hope it already accomplished it. Canada, which has not been a signatory to the global agreements, is going to be targeting at 2030. Germany, 2038, which is surprising. Great Britain, 2024, right around the corner. Greece, again, not surprising, not a very rich country, 2028. Israel, 2030. Sweden, 2022. New Zealand, another very climate-friendly, progressive country, aiming for 2035. And Finland, aiming for 2030. France is in here somewhere for 2021. So Netherlands, another surprise for me, at 2030 being the target date. So the point is that this carbon fractal is real in terms of many of us, many countries, and the infrastructure being trapped and having this feedback upward and downward from city level to state level and above, and global level and back down. In the meantime, the focus on CO2 has evolved, and a lot of the past climates also now have been put in the framework of CO2 levels. So a lot of effort goes into estimating past levels of CO2 with various proxies and modeling. Obviously, you don't have data all the way back, but you can use various proxies like stomata, liverworts, paleosols, alkenones, foraminifera. Paleosols are basically old soils, ice cores, and so on, to look at CO2 parts per million in the past. And we talk about how there have been levels that are many times larger than where we are at present, at about 400. Actually, we are somewhere here, 420 or so ppm. So this is a nice figure, an article by Nicola Jones on Yale 360 that shows the large swings in CO2, the ice core data we have looked at a lot, and then the Holocene, and then where we are headed, since industrial revolution is hardly seen here. But these are the projections for the various future scenarios that we talked about, 4.5, 6, and 8.5. RCP 2.5 wants to bring us down to keep us on a safe track trajectory, right? We have also cast those now in terms of greenhouse gas emissions going into the future. So this is going from 2010 into 2030, which is a short time horizon, and we are looking here at gigaton CO2 equivalent per year, where we are converting other greenhouse gases like HFCs, CFCs, N2O, CH4, and whatever else I missed into CO2 equivalents using the stoichiometries. And as we know, business as usual with no policies would keep increasing this beyond what we want, and there are current policies for reducing greenhouse gases which would bring us down quite impressively if you're not worried about temperature targets. But then there are also the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, where most of the countries have committed, and there are what are called unconditional NDCs. So for a country like India, for example, for its own good, it will invest in renewables, afforestation, and other electric vehicles and so on, which are called unconditional. And then there are additional greenhouse gas reductions implementing under conditional INDCs, where there are finances involved, where a country like India would get some help externally to make additional cuts in greenhouse gases. Various mechanisms are set up in the Paris Agreement for that. Of course, then if we want to get down to safe targets as defined by IPCC itself, then additional GHG reductions are required to be embarked on at a least cost pathway from 2020 onward. We are already behind. We are in 2021 as I record this. So this is the idea of using various models focused on the CO2 framework for the past and the future, and for all the policy frameworks to track our progress on climate change. And of course we have seen this already a couple of times. This goes from 1990 into 2100, again looking at annual global greenhouse gas emissions, so again in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. No climate policies are now mapped onto temperature changes, 4.1 to 4.8 degrees centigrade. By all the past data and modeling experiments, we can say this is not really an acceptable range. Current policies bring us down to 2.8 to 3.2 degrees centigrade, trying to stay below 50 gigaton CO2 equivalent per year. We are almost there already. So many people use that as a way to say there is a deadline to save ourselves, which many scientists don't agree with, including me. And there are pledges and targets to bring it further down, but obviously the pathways have to include drawing down CO2 with direct air capture and other methods to bring the temperatures and the CO2 emissions down. We talk about negative emission technologies and so on. Obviously there will be carbon emissions, some are not avoidable, so the idea is that we draw down more CO2 than we emit. But this is essentially, in brief, the so-called CO2 politics, the rise of CO2 politics, where climate has now been simplified into a carbon management issue, and there are numerous uncertainties in the carbon cycle, especially into the future and in the past. I have a course called The Global Carbon Cycle based on a primer from David Archer, where we discuss many of these issues that you can look up. But in this context, in terms of how we have arrived at this current thinking, this is where we are. Putting all our eggs into this CO2 basket and trying to manage the global agreements and actions and future directions of global warming in terms of CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so that concludes this section. We will now get into the next section in the next podcast.